The 2009 Defence White Paper really dismissed climate change as an issue beyond the scope of the planning horizons set out in that paper, that is to 2030. The premise of, or the underlying argument, I suppose, of heavy weather, our new report on climate change in the Australian Defence Force, is that earlier approach from the White Paper is no longer appropriate. And that's because, as set out in the paper, the impacts of climate change are being felt now, and Defence will need to respond, not on its own, but rather as part of an Australian whole of government approach, and of course in coordination with Australia's international policies on climate change. The paper does not certainly suggest that the Defence Department or the ADF lead on climate change, but what we do argue is that the missions that Defence will undertake, the impacts on defence capability, the impacts of Defence on Defence personnel, the impacts indeed on the entire Defence estate need to factor in a changing climate. So consequently, in the report, we set out a number of recommendations of how Defence should adopt a fresh approach, a new approach to dealing with the potentially destabilising impacts of a changing climate. I guess the most fundamental recommendation that we make is that Defence ought to appoint a senior Defence officer to be the climate advisor to the Chief of Defence Force. We recommend that that role should be undertaken by the Director General of the Navy's Oceanography and Hydrography branch. That branch already has very good connections with the Bureau of Meteorology. So it should lead as the climate advisor, and indeed one of the suggestions that we make is that one of the first tasks of the climate advisor is to produce a responding to climate change in Defence plan that would look at the impacts of climate change across the Defence estate and Defence capability. Secondly, we suggest that Defence does have a whole range of environmental data that it should examine to see to what extent it may be relevant to understanding climate change and hence informing better decision making in Defence. Some years ago, the United States Navy, and last year in Britain too, the British Navy released a lot of classified material gathered by submarines, their submarine operations in the Arctic. So what we're suggesting in the paper is that Defence too should see to what extent it should release data that might be of benefit to understanding the dynamics of climate change. And also we suggest that given the enormous range and size of the Defence estate, that Defence itself, without any great hindrance, could, by adding sensors to various military facilities, gather useful information to better inform climate decision making. We also suggest that Defence team with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency to form an interagency task force that would look at the security implications of climate change and what role that Defence could play potentially in any outcomes. Our intelligence agencies too ought to be stress testing, that is looking at regional countries to see where the threat multipliers are that can be generated by climate change. Now, of course, energy efficiency, while a separate subject, is intimately linked with climate change. So in the report, we recommend that Defence set up a green team that would potentially look at energy savings across the defence organisation. At the moment, Defence will pay a carbon tax. Defence is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in terms of government agencies. So we feel that, and argue in the report, that Defence does have a role to play when it comes to energy efficiency. The other thing we suggest in terms of the organisation being informed of how climate change and climate science may impact on defence is that there be a much greater interchange between the climate scientific community and the defence organisation. For example, through regular workshops and conferences, through the hosting of postdoctoral fellows within the Defence Force Academy and at our military staff colleges. So the report fundamentally argues that just as the military currently factor in changing technology and demographics and so forth into their planning, so too do they need to factor in a changing climate when it comes to the physical battle space that Defence operating in. So this report doesn't recommend, if you like, that Defence subscribe to a green view of the world. Rather, what we're arguing in the report is that Defence need to factor in the potentially destabilising impacts of climate change, both in the region and also on the home front when it comes to extreme weather events.